Okay. 3, 2, 1.
Hi all, thank you very much for joining us today again. This time we will continue our discussions on Rand's thoughts on the importance of philosophy. Today's essay is Philosophical Detection. It appears as the second chapter of Philosophy Who Needs It. Discussing it we have done. Don has co-authored books like Equal is Unfair and The Moral Case for Finance. You can follow him on the website donswriting.com. We also have James Valliant. He's the author of Creating Christ and The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics. And to the audience, before we begin, feel free to make questions through the super chat feature on YouTube. We will be tracking it live. Okay, let's start. And Don, I was wondering if you could quickly recap the main ideas of Philosophy Who Needs It, which is one of the core parts of the introduction of the essay.
Right. Rand wrote this following the publication of the speech that she gave on Philosophy Who Needs It. And in Philosophy Who Needs It, she's talking about the role of philosophy in life and why people should be interested in philosophy. And to summarize the essence of her answer, it's that we all have a philosophy, that we all have a basic view of the world, of human knowledge, of man's relationship to existence. And the question is that true or false? And if we have these kind of basic assumptions that are shaping our thinking and shaping our lives, we really need to examine them critically. And Rand doesn't give too much information or too much advice on how to examine philosophy critically in that speech. And so now in Philosophical Detection, she's going to give kind of the advice that everybody, whether or not they're going to go into the field of philosophy, but what everyone who has to govern their lives by philosophy needs to know in order to be able to navigate these very difficult and sometimes intimidating waters.
Exactly. The field of philosophy is so fundamental, the most fundamental field of knowledge, and so comprehensive in its application and implications everywhere that it is inescapable. But most people are not self-conscious philosophers at all. And professional philosophers in recent centuries have quite let them down. So most people hold their philosophy in a sort of, seat of the pants way through catchphrases. And in that first essay, Ayn Rand went through several common catchphrases, their origins and how they impact people's thinking. And in this essay, she's going to start breaking down at least some of those and adding some others to show how those philosophical ideas are operative in people's lives, especially when we don't think them through in fundamental ways, and lead, in effect, to a misunderstanding and a rationalization, in effect, of their given emotions.
Perfect, thank you. Now, James, getting into the essay as such, I would ask you, what are the principles that a philosophical detective should keep in mind? And related to that, what is the role of philosophical structure while starting to being a detective in this kind of issues?
Well, understanding the role of philosophy itself is to understand, I'll use a fancy word here, the hierarchical relationship of knowledge, that certain knowledge is based on previous other knowledge, and you can't get the conclusions of certain knowledge without getting the foundation straight. And it's that hierarchical structure of philosophy which really is part of what indicates its power and its pervasiveness, but it's that hierarchical structure that people are often completely blind to. They don't understand the fundamental roots of the ideas that are governing their lives. There are various reasons for that. They don't really take them straight and literally. They sort of think of them as just partial answers, but they'll use the sort of partial answer as a rough and ready guide to existence, sort of a stand-in ad hoc philosophy, or a real integrated philosophy which understands and appreciates the hierarchical relationship between ideas is necessary, and why we need it, and why that's really the only alternative to this seat of your pants sort of ad hoc philosophy of going by sayings, which so many people just do.
Don, related to something that James has just said, is Rand talks about this layman's error while going through philosophy. Could you talk a bit more about that kind of error that Rand talks about, and could you give us some examples?
Well, so the layman's error she talks about it's basically taking over ideas and treating them as self-evident. So one way to think about it is, she's talking about that philosophy has a certain structure that we need to be aware of. It's that philosophy deals with the fundamentals of human knowledge, and you can think of that as it's the assumptions behind all of our other knowledge. And so what the layman often does, what a person who's not philosophic does, is they treat certain assumptions as primaries, as well, this is just self-evident. This is not open to question. And part of what Rand's saying is that no, everything is open to question except the primaries. And what really are primaries? Well, it's that which can't be analyzed. It's that which you can't get underneath. It's that which is a self-evident starting point. And she thinks ultimately this is only the evidence of the senses. That which we can have directly from sense experience is a primary. Everything else is built on earlier knowledge. And so to be philosophic is to ask, okay, what assumptions am I making that are open to question, have to actually be established? And so, for example, you could take in ethics, it's taking altruism as a starting point and asking, can we validate it scientifically, or do we need religion? Does it require us to let a train run over 10 people or pull a lever that only runs over one, but we were responsible for doing it? What you would have to do is step back and say, well, wait a minute, before we can start asking like how to justify altruism or exactly what it requires of us, we have to start and ask, like, is this true? That's an assumption. It's not obvious. And so that's the kind of way in which people are taking over conclusions and treating them as self-evident. And that to be philosophic is not to do that. You have to say, okay, you have to keep asking, like, what's the assumption behind this idea? Okay, what's the assumption behind that idea? What's the assumption behind that idea, until you get back to the evidence of the senses. And that you can take as a starting point. That is your solid ground that you can work from. And that is kind of the basic methodology of somebody who's thinking philosophically and trying to really contend with philosophic ideas.
It's the difference between that pig who's gathering the acorns and then going for the root of the cause, the tree of the acorns, without knowing it. So many people don't realize the genetic dependence, the hierarchical necessary dependence of earlier ideas. So what she's getting us to think, what ideas depend on what earlier ideas, and ultimately can we ground this in the evidence of sense perception? Until we can go reduce our idea, no matter how abstract it is, all the way back down to the evidence of the senses, to observation itself, we don't really have the grounding. We don't really have an understanding of the thing. And we have to really be able to reduce even the most abstract ideas all the way back to their grounding in reality, concrete observation, perception, for every philosophic idea.
And James, also related to this story of the pig and the acorn, she talks about not only eating the roots of the acorn, but also not eating whatever fruit one finds.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk more about that?
Right. Because if we're just consuming like the indiscriminate pig on the ground, whatever is coming off whatever tree, we don't analyze where it comes from, what it depends on, then we could be digesting poison without even knowing it. We have to be able to discriminate acorns from poisonous fruit. And to know that, we have to know what tree it's coming from. And that can only be answered, in effect, but if you get the metaphor, by philosophy, because philosophy is what's getting at the most abstract and fundamental ideas.
Yeah. So just to put that in non-philosophic or non-metaphorical terms, or to give examples. So for instance, antitrust law, it claims that we're preserving competition. And you'll often get conservatives who think, okay, well, I love competition. I love free markets. So man, I'm all for antitrust. But if you get that the view of competition behind antitrust is this idea of perfect competition, which really has nothing to do with freedom. And indeed, if you were to have perfect competition, it could only be through anti-freedom. If you don't know that, then you can end up swallowing this poison that's undermining one of your alleged convictions, or one that I was thinking about recently. So, Jordan Peterson talks about how what the lesson of the biblical stories is the idea of the importance of sacrifice. And sacrifice, in his view, is our discovery that we could pay a price today and get something better in the future. So it's in effect an investment. And so we need to be willing to pay a price today for an even greater future. And indeed, we should seek to pay the highest price in order for the greatest possible future. And if you realize that the tree that he's eating from is the religious tree, that's what it's really telling you, is that the price you're paying is life and happiness on earth in order to serve God, and maybe for some heavenly bliss for yourself. That what it really means is a sacrifice in the specific sense of surrendering your personal earthly happiness. And that is not an investment, that is a loss. And so this is the whole perspective from which what the pig is doing is it's missing out on the big picture. And why is it missing out on the big picture? Because it didn't look down to the roots. It didn't start with the foundations and see everything in light of its foundations, for better and for worse. And so that's the what she's really calling on us to do, is recognize that fundamentals are funny because they shape everything else. And yet, if you don't do the work to connect them to everything else, they seem so remote, so innocuous. And you will totally run into this if you try to study philosophy. So you'll read Hume, and he'll just start out by saying, like, look at these kind of sensations that we have, and they're different from the way that we put them together into impressions. Offhand, I'm probably botching this terminology because I I always get mixed up with the way that Locke, Hume, and Kant kind of conceptualize things with different language. But the point being, it'll all seem like, okay, I don't know exactly why he's making this point, but there's something to it. Yeah, I mean, I've had this experience, and he'll give cute little examples. And you don't realize that what you're doing is you're swallowing a whole way of looking at things that ends up obliterating perception, concepts, causality, and so on. And then you don't, and you might not realize that obliterating those is going to obliterate every specific value that you care about: your work, romantic love, political freedom. And so it's being able to see from these abstract, seemingly remote ideas the fruit that they bear. That is really the art of thinking philosophically. It's the ability to take these very abstract ideas. Think about the way that children will eat fruit, and I love strawberries, I love apples, I love peaches and everything. And then if you just showed them a picture of roots, like, what does that have to do with all these apples and things that I love? And if you were like, well, no, this has everything to do with it, like, they couldn't comprehend that. And that's the way most people are with respect to philosophy.
Exactly. Great examples. Really great examples. People will not, the key to this, and Ayn Rand gets into this in the next bit, in effect, people don't take these philosophical catchphrases, these generalizations, straight for meaning exactly what they mean. They think, oh, well, what you really mean when you say that, it's your truth versus my truth, and no one can ever get at the truth. What they mean to say is that everyone has their own little perspective. They're not attacking the ability of us to know the truth or reality itself, that there is a reality and one truth. They're not doing that. They're just applying it in this little instance here, rather than taking the philosophical abstraction that they've stated straight. It's an attack on truth. And one of the first things we have to do is take those philosophical assertions, generalizations, principles straight for exactly what they mean in all of their actual implications. And you realize it's an assault on truth as such. Your truth versus my truth.
And Don, I think another common mistake that people make, and we have already touched about that. It's the idea of stolen concepts. Could you talk a bit more about what is that, and could you also comment in any other kind of common mistakes that people usually don't perceive in this kind of philosophical ideas?
Yeah, so a stolen concept, we said that the to think philosophically is to identify the fact and to be cognizant of the fact that knowledge rests on earlier knowledge, that there's underlying assumptions that you have to think through, all going all the way back to the roots of the tree, to the self-evident starting points. And what the stolen concept is when people in effect um, try to use a concept, try to use an idea without regard or with actively disregarding the roots, without not taking into account the foundations. And the the classic example that makes this kind of easiest to get that objectivists use is the statement, all property is theft. And the idea is, well, what is theft? Theft is it's not just taking something from somebody, it's taking something that doesn't belong to you from someone else. In other words, it's taking somebody's property away from them. So you don't even have the right to the concept theft if you are trying to overturn the concept of property. And Rand thinks that this happens all throughout philosophy, that they feel like the concepts are there. How did they get there? No, we just take them for granted as starting points. I mean, you could think of really like the ultimate stolen concept, and indeed it's a whole system of stolen concepts, is any form of the primacy of consciousness. So Descartes, he has probably the most famous catchphrase in all of philosophy, which is, I think, therefore I am. And it's the idea that, man, we should be skeptical of everything and just say what is beyond doubt. Where do we start in philosophy? What's something we can say this is clearly beyond doubt? And he says, well, it's that I'm a thinking being. And then later on we can kind of derive the existence of God, and then finally we can derive the existence of the world and know that there's something that there's something out there that exists, that it's not just thoughts in my head. And Rand's idea is that no, like it before you could even have the concept of consciousness, there has to be something out there it can be aware of. Otherwise, how does it even identify itself as consciousness? You're stealing the concept consciousness if you don't start with, as Rand would put it, existence exists. And so the idea that you have to like go through gyrations to derive a world is completely wrong. And it's because she won't engage in stolen concepts. If she's going to say consciousness exists, she's going to go, well, where the hell did I get that from? What does that assume? Say, well, it assumes that in order to identify itself as consciousness, it first has to be conscious of something. So first I have to know that there is something. So that is kind of like one of the preeminent fallacies in philosophy. But we get a few others in this essay, and they're not all mutually exclusive and often related. But the two big ones that come up are stolen concepts I heard he said that, anti-concepts and package deals. And I mean, just to simplify the basic ideas that, when we have a concept, we're putting together things that we think, yeah, these belong in a group together, and we can treat that group as the same in some respect. And so and what often happens in philosophy is that people put into a package, they treat as identical things that are essentially different. And I mean, if you think of Ayn Rand's ethics, I mentioned the way that people take altruism for granted. Well, one reason they'll take altruism for granted, well, obviously that's what it means to be ethical, is that, well, what's the alternative? Well, it's selfishness. And you can't think that like robbing, cheating, stealing is ethical. So we can throw that out. And obviously we start with altruism. But that's because they're treating selfishness as a package deal. They're putting Howard Rourke and Bernie Madoff into it. They're putting Donald Trump and Thomas Jefferson into it. And so it's if you want to think philosophically, it's not just that you just start with your concepts and trace them back to their roots. You have to make sure that the concepts are legitimate. And so much of what goes wrong in philosophy is not that like people are really bad at following Aristotle's laws of logic, though that happens. It's way more that their concepts that they're working with are illegitimate.
Yeah. And this goes to last week's essay where I wasn't here. Why the importance of Ayn Rand's understanding, for the first time, really understanding the relationship between universals and concretes, solving that problem is of vital importance, because people really get messed up on the conceptual level this way. Their concepts will either have no referent to reality and not really be a valid concept at all, or be an invalid concept because, as Don says, they're grouping things together that don't belong together. And that happens all the time. When we were talking about politics, for example, political versus economic power, coming up with the concept robber baron for an industrialist, that's a package deal. They're trying to force, two things together that don't belong together so that they can think about them in a sloppy way together.
Oh, just to interject, I mean, that was the whole thing that's going on with Jordan Peterson's Sacrifice.
Yeah,
It's a package deal between an investment and a loss.
right. And that's that in ethics, it's vital that we distinguish that and understand what sacrifice is. And getting back to another essay we did, causality versus duty, paying the appropriate price we have to do sometimes for our highest values. That's not a matter of duty or sacrifice. That's a matter of simple causality. The things we need to get our highest values sometimes are hard work. So we have to really that conflation that Jordan Peterson makes is of vital importance in ethics. It obscures one of the most important aspects of the difference between altruism and egoism.
So Jordan Peterson hides the idea of sacrifice through investment, and ESG hide the idea of investment through sacrifice. I was wondering, this is to both, but why don't we start with you, James? What is I think one of the most striking things of this essay is that Rand thinks that selfishness is crucial for being a philosophical detective. Could you talk about the relationship between being objective and being selfish?
Well, yeah, she has a wonderful, and this is maybe one of the most important parts of this essay, in my view, is a very common misunderstanding that any kind of self-interest must distort cognition, must twist our knowledge and somehow create cognitive biases, personal interests, and any kind of personal contribution or interest to the subject of an intellectual process, a process of simply knowing reality through logic, must be distorted to the extent that it has any connection to my personal interest. Ayn Rand says, no. The fact that something is dispassionate does not mean it is disinterested. The fact that we're not being an emotionalist about our thinking and using emotions as tools of cognition or as substitutes or fill in frog DNA for our gaps in our reason is a very selfish matter indeed. And if we don't understand the selfishness of thinking, we really don't have the motivation to be objective. She goes on to explain how introspection is a real necessity precisely because we're motivated to get to the truth. And it's that selfish motive to get to the truth that tells us to say, wait a minute, I've got to introspect. Sometimes I've got to be critical of my own biases and emotions and perspective, take them into account as I'm thinking. More than that, understand where emotions come from. If I understand where my emotions come from, their basis in my evaluations, then I can understand the relationship and evaluate the evaluation itself. Absent being able to do that, objectivity is not possible. Objectivity is a selfish process, but a selfish process that requires rigorous introspection and understanding of where emotions come from. That is a selfish motive. There could be no more selfish motive than finding the truth. If reason is our only means of knowledge, if reason is our basic tool of survival, then nothing could be more practically selfish for me. Nothing could be more practically selfish for me than just this topic, my strict, rigorous objectivity, my ability to introspect about my biases, my ability to identify the source of my emotions. So a disinterested process of logic is not an objective one. No, an objective one is one motivated, personally, selfishly motivated by the quest for the truth.
And notice how this is a perfect example of the layman's error we've been talking about. So if they're thinking about their interests, well, we just start with, yeah, well, clearly money, prestige, fame, all of that's to my interest. And yeah, sometimes it's a good thing to like get, what's true. Sometimes I need to manipulate my way. And I don't necessarily mean lying, cheating, stealing. But if people think better of me than is actually the case, or, like whereas her view of interest is, well, no, we need to go much deeper than that. We can't just say like, oh, there's these values out there. What really is good for human beings? And that it's by peeling back layer after layer that she's able to get to, well, what is the basic way that we succeed in the world? How do human beings actually achieve what's good for us and even identify what's good for us? Well, it's rooted in the fact that we survive by reason. And if reason is our basic means of survival, then we can't have an interest that's at odds with reason. We can't have an interest that puts us in conflict with reality cognitively or in any other way. And so, if you have that perspective, then the idea that something could be of value um, where it was not rooted in recognition of this is the way reality actually is, then you see, no, that's crazy. That's nonsense. But it's no, we just take values for granted as, well, these things seem pretty good. And Rand does not approach things that way because she's approaching things in a way that's actually philosophic.
Exactly.
I want to connect this point to the following part of the essay. And I think, Don, the question has to do with irreductible primaries that you've already talked about, and the relation and how they are the evidence provided by the senses. But aren't emotions also, to some extent, irreductible primaries? I mean, this is a tricky question, but couldn't one say that there is at least some part of the sensation of an emotion that is an irreductible primary?
What do you have in mind?
Like, for instance, if you feel anger, you will feel like some tightness on the chest, some anxiety on the body. I mean, that is the pure sensation, but at the same time, there's a psychological component, which I think it's not like you're angry because you were driving and someone just came across of you in a bad manner.
So Rand's view is that our emotions come from value judgments, from our ideas, from evaluating things as being in a beneficial or a harmful relationship to us. But and I mean, that's not a view that's unique to her, though. I mean, she was, let's say, early, to the game. It's really, I think, a dominant view in psychology today, thanks to the work of people like Aaron Beck and the cognitive behavioral therapy movement. But the issue is that, and so the issue is when you have an emotional experience, it's true that for any given evaluation, there's a hardwired emotional reaction to it. So if I experience something as threatening to my values, I feel fear. If I conclude that an injustice has been done to me or the things I can care about, it's just an irreducible fact of human nature that produces the emotion of anger. But the question is, what are the things that I'm evaluating as unjust? What are the things I'm evaluating as good for me? What are the things I'm evaluating as a threat to my values? All of that is the product of our past thinking and the automatic functions of our subconscious. So for any particular emotion, it's not irreducible in the sense of you can ask, well, what conclusions gave rise to this emotion? What was, to use the cognitive behavioral way of thinking about it, what were the automatic thoughts that were kind of generating this particular emotion? And that we can and have to analyze. And even that is an oversimplification, because it treats even conceptualizing what am I feeling as obvious. That's a real achievement too. Even to identify what I'm feeling is not irreducible. It takes a lot of work to think, oh, this is anger. And usually it's not just anger, it's anger. Our emotions are mixtures. So it's like anger mixed with sadness, or anger mixed with self-doubt, or, fear mixed with titillation, or like they're often complex. And then to ask, well, what's giving rise to it? It's a real kind of cognitive work. And there's, beyond the fact that any particular evaluation gives rise to a hardwired response, um, nothing about that is irreducible and unanalyzable. Indeed, really, you have to work to analyze it. And it's, Rand emphasizes how important introspection is here, but throughout her work, there's a real perspective that in many respects, that's kind of like human beings' original sin, if you were going to put it in those terms, which she probably never would. But like the inability and unwillingness to introspect, she thinks, is like the major driving force in people's reaching bad ideas and not achieving what they want out of life.
Yeah, she will repeat over and over. Emotions are not irreducible primaries, and they are certainly not tools of cognition. And why do I say they're not irreducible primaries, Alejandro? What is it that you are observing and perceiving in your emotional reaction? You perceive the thing that, the object that causes you to have the emotional reaction. It's beautiful, so you're attracted. It's an injustice, so you feel anger. The object is the object. The perception you're having of your emotion is your physiological reaction. So if we reduce it down to the perceptual, an emotion by itself is only your reaction to it. As Ayn Rand says in this essay, an emotion tells you nothing so much about reality, except that there's something you're reacting to. The emotion tells you about yourself. The emotion tells you how you react. So those observations, those direct observations of your anger, my blood pressure's going up, I'm having a certain physiological reaction, those perceptions, those observations that we're grounding that in are only observations about you, not about the thing itself. The thing itself is just what it is. And the emotion doesn't tell you about that. It tells you something about how you already evaluate things like that. So yes, we ground it down to its observational level like everything else, but the perceptions there are perceptions of my physiology and my reaction. They're not perceptions about the thing.
Exactly. So, James, the second part of the essay talks about why do these phrases and philosophies gain a grip in the culture. And one of those, it's lack of introspection, which I think we will talk about more about that. But another one, it's also something that you mentioned previously, which is the idea of people not taking a great deal of thought about that. Could you comment on that, on how people aren't that
Well,
focused in the ideas?
the reason why they use these generalizations, these catchphrases, and they're generally unintegrated and they're hit and miss, and they'll use them in an ad hoc way. The reason why they use that is the inescapability of philosophy. They have to have. We are conceptual beings. We have to, in effect, integrate our knowledge at some level. And so when people are doing things, they need some kind of abstract justification for what they're doing. Now, they don't have a self-conscious, and they certainly don't have an integrated system of philosophy in most cases. And so most people, the substitute for philosophy, which is an essential that everybody needs in most people's operative life, are these sort of vague catchphrases. And people who aren't particularly philosophical, people who aren't integrating their deepest generalizations, are sort of dependent upon the undigested thinking of other philosophers in the form of catchphrases, a generalization that they think is widely accepted, a general truth that grandma told me. And so that catchphrase, out of context from all our other generalizations, will serve as my justification, my grounding for what I'm doing. See, this is an example of that, and that's why I'm doing it. People need philosophy. And if they don't have a consistent, integrated philosophy grounded in reality, then what they're going to do is they're going to use the undigested products of previous philosophical thinking in the form of ready-made catchphrases, which give them a sort of rough and ready rationalization, if nothing else, for their approach.
Don, could you comment more on the idea of what Rand calls earned guilt within people for accepting these kind of ideas against the honored guilt that she talks about?
Yeah, I mean, so she makes this point. I mean, it's really surprising when you think, okay, because here's how it comes up, and I just remember being really not what I expected her answer to be.
She's great that way.
Yeah.
She's the master of paradox and surprise sometimes.
Yeah, so she's talking about unearned guilt, as we said. And then she says, the acceptance of unearned guilt is a major cause of philosophical passivity. There are other causes and other kinds of guilt which are earned. And a major cause of earned guilt in regards to philosophy, as well as in regard to their own minds and lives, is, and if you would have asked me to fill in that, I mean, what would come to mind? Like maybe you'd think, oh, she's going to say like altruism, or she's going to say evasion, but it's a failure of introspection. And you'd think, well, the earned guilt, like nobody really taught me to introspect, or like, why would that really be, central to it? But it's that what she really thinks is going on is that, I mean, first of all, those introspection is a skill, and one can be better or worse at it. Though she thinks that the whole, the basic nature of the process is something that's kind of open to us in a very intuitive way. She says that the two, major questions are what do I feel, and why do I feel it, and that these would be kind of like obvious questions that we should be asking. That most people don't do it, and then I think it certainly resonated with me. She says most men can give themselves only some primitively superficial answers to what do I feel and why do I feel it. And they spend their lives struggling with incomprehensible inner conflicts, alternatively repressing their emotions and indulging in emotional fits, regretting it, losing control again, rebelling against the mystery of their inner chaos, trying to unravel it, giving up, deciding to feel nothing, and feeling the growing pressure of fear, guilt, self-doubt, which makes the answers progressively harder to find. I mean, if that is not such a perceptive and deep analysis of patterns that we see like amongst people around us all our lives, and I've even seen it in my own life in regard to certain issues where I see like, oh, I keep repeating this mistake and I try to stop myself and gird my loins, but I can't really figure out why I'm like making it. And then it happens again once I can't exercise infinite self-discipline. And then to realize that its root is this, it's not continually pushing yourself to think, what do I feel and why do I feel it? And that she thinks that is kind of what is setting up the stage for two things. Well, it's one thing, but it comes in two varieties. She thinks that the complexity of our kind of inner states, particularly if we don't reflect on them over the course of years and decades, is it opens up the possibility of rationalization. And the rationalization happens in kind of two related ways. One is that there's the philosophers who develop systems of rationalization in order to justify their kind of internal emotional states and view of the world. Then there are the people who, as we've talked about, grasp on to the kind of popularized catchphrases that flow out of their systems in order to rationalize whatever they don't are not able to fully justify, and the kind of emotional states that they're desperate for some kind of account of, and you could think of it as final justification, a justification that nobody can challenge. It's like, it's, true for you, not but it's not true for me. Well, there's no answer to that. Like, I can't keep pushing, go, no, you're doing something really bad. It's like, well, that's it's bad for you, it's not bad for me. Like, I can't go anywhere from there. I've got my, he's got his justification there. That's the end of the discussion, that's the end of the argument. I can't judge him, I can't object. And so, yeah, it's that she thinks it's the failure of introspection that is kind of the, as I put it, the original sin that unleashes our ability to rationalize, and that bad philosophy is the ultimate tool of rationalization.
Right. Philosophers have been telling us that emotions are irreducible primaries, givens. Hume, Don mentioned earlier, basically our values are really just statements of emotional preference. There's nothing in reality about our values so much as it is just an assertion of personal value preferences. So there's philosophers who've been setting us on the wrong path. And until the recent advent of the discovery of cognitive behavioral psychology, which has swept the world of therapy, there was no good answer for it. So I guess that's sort of an innocent answer. But more than that, we've been actively misled. Take a phrase like "love is blind." I mean, really? What they're saying is, in effect, a rationalization for whatever I love. And yet it's this wonderful catchphrase that if I don't understand my emotions, I don't want to get behind my emotion of love, why it is I love certain things and not other things. I just want to justify this feeling that I have. And what a wonderful catchphrase philosophy provides you. Love is blind. You don't need to analyze it. It doesn't come from anywhere. It's a given.
James, there's also this idea that Rand talks about, which seemed to me really interesting, that culture keeps just like a man, like a subconscious, and that if you put a little seed of a bad idea, it will grow in both a brain and also in a culture. Could you talk more about that?
Oh, yeah. An error doesn't stop the operation of logic. An error doesn't stop the operation of our subconscious. Our minds do. The rational mind does work by means of logic, as she points out. That's how reason works. Now, the logic that happens will be based on faulty premises if our premises aren't clear, consistent, and grounded in reality. But they will find their inevitable conclusion. When Kant set a sort of pattern going in Western philosophy, Hegel was sort of the next step. Well, if we can't know this noumenal world, then get rid of this noumenal world. And guess what? It all comes down to the subjective and insides, the ideas of an elite, ultimately. That is Hegel's view. Well, if that's the next case, if that's the state, the next step would be, well, wait a minute. This elite isn't necessarily going to be all on board with the same idea. Therefore, we have to chuck principles entirely. This gives rise to pragmatism, to people like William James and John Dewey saying, well, there really is no truth. Truth is whatever happens to work, and don't be wedded to rigid principles. Go by whatever works in that situation. So this progression, this logical progression from Kant to Hegel's idealism to pragmatism, and then to even worse in the 20th century, is a natural, almost inevitable logical progression that one can hardly be surprised at, because that was contained in the seeds of what Kant did in the first place. Logic is still how the mind works, and human beings will work out logically the actual conclusion of the deepest premise that they've come to accept. Ultimately, you'll have the 20th century with linguistic analysts and existentialists, in effect, buying it all the way down. You're right. We can't really come to any abstractions at all. all we can do is analyze words. We can't come even to propositions, according to the linguistic analysts, right? The existentialist is basically thrown in the towel and said, yeah, it's this miserable nihilistic nonsense that we're living in, you know? So isn't that the natural logical progression of Kant and the things he said? There is a natural logical progression to error, just as there's a natural logical progression to truth. One creates a benevolent circle of getting better and better, closer and closer to the full truth, more and more reality coming into play. The other is a malevolent cycle, getting us further and further and further away from the conceptual level, and therefore our means of understanding reality.
I mean, this was really driven home to me when I wrote a book called Roosevelt Care on the creation of the American welfare state, and really traced how it started and then how it unfolded. And if we think about catchphrases as what you rely on to justify things, well, you don't, as Rand points out, it's not that a person is trying to hold on and apply a catchphrase, super consistently and make sure, like, I must always abide by, consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, which that would be a cute thing to try to do, given the particular content of that catchphrase. Rather, it's that you kind of snatch it at random, but then people can call you on that. And they can say, you're not really being true to that principle you've invoked to justify things. So if you think about the welfare state, it starts out with saying Americans for 50 years saying, no, we believe in property rights. We believe in being self-reliant. We believe that, if a person's in need, they can go ask and request for help. And we take care of our friends and family and things like that. Like the idea that the government is going to basically put an untold number of people in the dole. No, that's not what we're for. To oversimplify a bit, though, what essentially happened is saying, look, no, there's the neediest of the needy who can't, support themselves, that we have an obligation to help out. So we're going to create a program that's just going to help out the poorest of the poor and the very, very elderly who can't work for themselves. It's only going to cost you a tiny, tiny sliver of your income. It's never going to get bigger than that. And then the rest of the rest of your wealth is, yours to spend. Well, then people came along and said, well, wait, if it's true that we have an obligation to provide for the needs of others, surely why are you drawing the line at somebody who has, only $1 in their pocket? What about people with $2? What you're saying that the elderly need help and you're going to give them, $100 a month. They can't live on that. Why not 150? In other words, there's this, and then that process continues because the principle is that needs override rights. Well, there's always needs. There's always people of needs that they can't meet and haven't met. And so therefore, if that trumps a person's right to their income, if a person's so-called right to their income is only subsequent to meeting the needs of others in society, then there's a never-ending push by people saying, look, if you really take that principle seriously, there's more work to be done. There's less wealth to be left in the hands of the people who earned it. And so it's this way of which pushing people on the principle that they themselves have used to justify their actions and saying, hey, no, there's more work to be done here. That's part of how you get the kind of unfolding and a push to more and more consistency with it. And I think what James is talking about is, I think, a more expansive version of that. It's what happens when you have the broadest, most fundamental principles, and then they get pushed and kind of taken to their logical conclusion over time. But we should add, this isn't kind of a determinism. It's that process will continue in pattern unless people push back and rebel. And if they push back and rebel in fundamental terms and reject the principle, then you can get things going in a wonderful direction. What more often happens is that people kind of have an emotional rebellion of, no, this is too much. This is too far. So if somebody had said, if somebody had come along, and indeed they did come along with the welfare state and said, hey, look, there's these unmet needs. What we really need is universal basic income, that, guaranteed income for every American. And in order to do it, we're going to tax people at give them a maximum income, as McGovern tried to do. They're appealing to the principle, and they're right, but that's too much for people, and they'll rebel. But it's not a principled rebellion. And so what happens is there kind of a pause. The purveyors of altruism take 2 steps backward. They wait a couple decades, and then what they're doing now, which is, hey, there's a pandemic. Well, everybody just needs an income. And then, hey guys, let's try to make it permanent now, and in fact have a universal basic income through the back door. So it's more complicated than just saying, like, once you invoke a bad principle, it inevitably follows. But over time, and unless there's a challenge to the principle, that is indeed what happens.
Yeah, I just love Don's concrete political examples. They're a lot easier to get at than Hegel and existentialism and the logical development there. But yeah, see, we have free will. Ayn Rand came along. There's all of us. We appreciate what Ayn Rand's doing to some extent, and we're trying to promote it. We have free will. She ultimately had free will, powerful free will. And so, yeah, it's not an inevitable course of things. People can reject it. But as Don says, look at that rejection, that sort of emotional, non-principled rejection of the right to the left. Well, that's going too far, and it just doesn't feel. I mean, I buy into your premise, I guess, partially, but you're going too far. That's never going to be enough to stop it, to answer it. And you'll notice that the left, the Labor parties, and the Democratic Party in America are always insatiable. They're always pushing for more. There's no theoretical end to it, because on the other side, they've basically conceded the principle, and they're living in a confused, contradictory state.
And Don, why is altruism such a constant in this, what Rand calls evil systems of philosophy?
So the aspect that Rand emphasizes in this particular essay, because I think she is, if you would have probed her or look at her other writings, I think there's other reasons she thinks that altruism is a universal feature of it. But what she emphasizes in this essay is the way in which it's an unachievable ideal, and that makes it perfect for rationalization. And to see why, if you think about Christianity, right? So if Christianity says, look, we're all sinners, nothing can ever count as the achievement of the Christian morality except that which is impossible to you, which is being Jesus. Well, then nothing ever counts as failure. So, for instance, the person who lusts in his heart is the same person who is in the same moral category as the person who murders with his gun. It's, well, look, we both have fallen short, or from the other perspective, we've both fulfilled our moral duty, right? Like we're sinners who repent. And so it's what altruism does is it gives you a standard that cannot be achieved. You can never say, okay, I've achieved the good of others, now I'm good, right? Like, no, so long as you're living and breathing, you are selfishly using up values like eating food, gaining some modicum of pleasure. Like, there's never a point at which you can say, I've sacrificed enough, so long as you're living and breathing. And if that is true, well, then nobody can ever, come along and in effect say, or let me put it differently. Think of what, the Soviet Union did, right? Like, we're out to achieve the welfare of others. Well, since nothing can count as success and say, oh, yes, this country has now achieved the welfare of others, then nobody can also say, no, this is failure to achieve the welfare of others. And that indeed is exactly what happened, the Soviet Union is, hey, we're sacrificing for the good of humanity. And it's, well, we see the sacrifices, we don't see the good of humanity. Well, that's fine. Like that, I mean, that's what, there's nothing that you can indict there, because there is no achievable sort of standard. And that is what she thinks is, I think, the major reason that altruism is popping up is it's the eternal get out of jail free card. Don't blame me. I'm not being selfish. All right. Well, are you achieving the good of others? I'm not being selfish.
Right. The ultimate guilt escape clause and impossible ethics, right? We're all guilty. And so it's sort of like a moral get out of jail free card. I'll go further and more specific. I think that a lot of the basis for rationalization are people have given political outcomes they want. And those are sort of taken as given. They have given ethical and political outcomes that they want. And everything else, all the other fundamentals in philosophy, this is what she means when she says previous philosophies are basically systems of rationalization. They're rationalization for the consequences that people emotionally want, political and sometimes ethical consequences that people want, and all the deeper questions of philosophy are geared to a justification of that. They're a giant rationalization of an emotion. Ayn Rand's wonderful definition in this essay of rationalization. It's the emotion they're trying to justify. It's not reality they're trying to get at. And here you can really see it. I do blame politics and certain ethical consequences as the sort of emotional conclusions that people want to get at. They don't question it. What is the earthly motivation, as Ayn Rand points out elsewhere, for altruism, but power here on earth, manipulating people here on earth? It's always given some mystical, supernatural justification because altruism has no earthly justification. But really, altruism in effect itself is a giant rationalization for manipulating people, for power, for collecting sacrifices here on earth. It's not the mystic mumbo jumbo that is necessarily given in its justification. Altruism is the emotional thing that ultimately people are rationalizing in pseudo-philosophy. Because they all, as she points out, they all accept the premise, the given of altruism, but they all have various and different ways of coming at it, justifying it epistemologically and ethically.
I want to connect that last point that you did, James, with the final part of the essay. And this question is for both, but let's start with you, James. Basically, one of the things, it's a long paragraph, and Rand talks about how Kant doesn't really need you to get all the philosophy that he goes for, but actually, quote, a thinker like Kant does not want you to agree with him. All he wants is for you to give him the benefit of the doubt. He knows that your own subconscious will do the rest. Could you talk a bit more about the process and the goal that Kant or the people who propose this?
The example of ethics that we were using is a good one here, and maybe it's a good entree into it. The duty ethics of Kant are a classic example. Even Kant did not, he's trying to justify, in effect, a Christian worldview of duty first over any interest you have in this world. That's his ultimate psychological motive. And in presenting this philosophy of duty that has nothing to do with your own self-interest or success here on earth at all. Don't even look at consequences. In fact, if you've got an interest in the matter, you can't qualify that immediately disqualifies it as having moral significance precisely because you have an interest. That's a test for Kant. If that's the case, if you've got this kind of duty altruism, he's got to be aware that people can't live up to it. In fact, he implies it in several times. He thinks, I don't mean to give a bizarre example here, but Kant was opposed to masturbation. It did not serve the categorical imperative. So it's out. You can't really think about that. Masturbation is this awful thing. So what is the point that he's trying to do? He's trying, in effect, to get people to feel guilty about their natural impulses. Guilt is in opposition to your success on earth, to your inclinations, to your natural desires. Now, I know nobody's going to be able to live up to that, just like Christianity can't be lived up to. So what's the real point here? The real point here is to undermine your confidence in ethics. You can't really be a consistent Kantian any more than you can be a consistent Christian. And see, that's it. You have guilt and shame. You're not living up to it. It can't really be lived up to anyway. So it's a moral get out of jail free card when I do slip up. But you see, you're no good if you aren't fully on his duty path here. What's the real purpose of that? It's a giant rationalization, in effect, to get people to feel guilty for not being able to live up to his system of ethics. So what is the psychological motive of something like that? To have us all, in effect, in a state of unearned guilt and shame about our inability to live up to what's truly ethical. It's a psychological motive. Did that answer the question?
Don, would you like to add something to that?
No, I mean, there's what more can you say? That's I think spot on. I mean, you can push further and say, well, why is it so important for them to impose guilt on people? And I mean, certainly I think that's easier to see in a more political context, right? Like guilt is the precondition for grasping for power. But you can also think about it in personal relationships. A lot of how people manipulate those around them is through the use of guilt. I mean, what is part of the whole phenomenon of what's the phrase that, gaslighting? Part of like, why are you making people feel crazy? Part of it's you're making them feel guilty. And so but people think, what about a professor in Königsberg who's just kind of sitting in a room and like teaching some students, what's going on there? And there it's part of what Rand's view is that even power lust is kind of a superficial way of understanding what is driving people. That she thinks that when you're dealing with evil, what it really is it's a desire to destroy things that you hate. And so if you imagine somebody who is kind of the way I try to explain it to people is that and I mentioned this when I was talking about inequality with Harry Binswanger on an ARC channel. So forgive me for those of you who've heard it, but I find it really helpful, which is, if you've ever been kind of like in a room and somebody really, beautiful or well dressed or ripped, sits down in front of you and you start to feel a little self-conscious and it makes you aware of your own self-doubt. And often these are kind of fleeting feelings that we have for a moment. But imagine if it was that you felt that way a lot of the time, and that be kind of your driving motive, is that these people around you are making you feel insecure. They think they're better than you and you want to take them down a notch. It's not that you think, oh man, I gotta pump myself up, I gotta go like hit the gym or buy a better suit or take better care. But no, I'm gonna show that they think they're so good. He thinks he's so badass because he has these huge muscles, or he thinks he's so great because he runs an investment bank and has money and flies in a private airplane. I'm gonna show you. And if you think about kind of the Kantian system, it's that you think you guys out there who are pursuing pleasure and joy and really seem to be like getting something out of life, you think you're special. No, I'm nobler than you are. I'm moral. I'm living the right kind of life. And I should be the kind of most heralded, celebrated thing. And so I have a whole system that says, you guys think that you know a lot, you know nothing about reality. You guys are pursuing happiness, that makes you wicked. And so it's a way of kind of lashing out at people who make you experience your own inferiority and trying to establish superiority. So that's as James was saying, it's very psychological and it's so twisted that it's very hard for people to conceive. And the best you can kind of do is think about your kind of worst moments or out of context moments where you feel kind of motivated by Schadenfreude or some amount of like, oh, I'm feeling insecure. Not because somebody's like attacking me, but just their very being is eliciting that. And most of us don't have that many moments like that, but we have enough that if all you have to do is really think it through to its logical conclusion, and you can get how you can have somebody like a Kant who, yeah, they basically never leave, their little hovel and never do much more than write their books and spout ideas. And yet it's all motivated by the same thing that is driving a Stalin or a Hitler to slaughter entire continents.
Boy, what an outstanding point. Power lust, of course, is just an emotion. It's not an irreducible primary and requires analysis, and it has psychological reasons. And believe it or not, the psychological reasons for the power luster are much the same, if in a different form, than their manipulated followers, the sheep that go along with them. Self-esteem, a lack of self-esteem. And that's why the inducing of guilt is so important here. We can't afford, if you lack self-esteem chronically, such that you're a power luster, the one thing you cannot afford is self-esteem on the part of your followers, because they got to go along with the guilt message that you're propounding. So both the power luster and his victim, his willing victim, in effect, are driven psychologically by a lack of self-esteem, which is why the inducing of guilt and shame is the psychological motive of so much of this. A man of self-esteem is impossible to rule, as Ayn Rand so many ways and so many times eloquently shows.
And here she says, like, you cannot con an honest man, right?
Right.
I think this is almost the last question, Don. Could you, one of the last things that Rand talks about is this idea of open mind. Could you comment on her criticism and the alternative that she provides for this concept?
Yeah, well, I mean, she takes this idea of open mind versus closed mind, and she actually thinks like closed-mindedness is an anti-concept, and that what it's doing is it's grouping together what she thinks of as mental passivity, the refusal to look at new evidence, the refusal to consider arguments against your position, and it's by treating it as closed mind, what it's meant to do is erase the distinction between the passive minded person and the person who has reached a conviction. So it's, you've reached a conviction. How can't you just be riddled with doubt when I come along and say, no, you might have considered 482 proofs of God, but I really have the one that works. And so like, you need to, spend your lives, looking at it and who knows, maybe you made a mistake in one of them. And her view is that no, keeping an open mind is the idea of um, being not being certain when you are and are right to be certain, to be riddled with doubt in cases where you've gone through the process necessary to be entitled to say, I know it, I'm right. And that what you should strive for is an active mind. It's a mind that is interested in knowing what's true, interested in looking at the evidence. But then once you've grasped the principle involved, that you are willing to say, no, I'm not going to consider this. Like I don't need 400 variants of the primacy of consciousness to know that the primacy, if it's primacy of consciousness, I'm through with it. And this is one of the things people were so astonished by Ayn Rand's ability to read 2 paragraphs of a philosopher and predict the rest of their system. And it was precisely because she didn't start out doing that. It's that she went laboriously through tracing back. All right, these are the consequences of their view. What were the fundamentals? What were the starting points? And and she saw over and over again, it was the same kinds of starting points that were generating the same sorts of errors 30 steps down the road. And so she was active minded in that way of like delving into these different philosophies. And then she reached a certain principle, like the primacy of existence for the primacy of consciousness. And when she saw that a philosopher was slipping in the primacy of consciousness at the foundation of philosophy, it wasn't, oh, well, maybe their particular variant of it has it really gets to the truth. It's like, no, I know that where this deviates from reality and I know where that has to lead. And so it's really asking us to think of active mindedness versus passive mindedness, rather than these kind of plausible but in the end really harmful package deals of open mind versus closed mind.
Yeah, and that's the key there. What a classic example of a package deal open closed mind is. It has this seductive little part here. We think of the person who refuses to consider new evidence on any topic, a passive mind. And that passive mind, part of it, is stated in this ridiculous overstatement. You mean we can never come to a conclusion? We can never come to a principle. We can never make a universal generalization, because, as stated, you can never close your mind with a conclusion. You can never close your mind by saying, well, at least I know this. So it's a package deal, which puts in two different things. One, we don't like people who aren't open to considering new evidence when it comes along. That is the passive mind, which is really the bad idea here, versus the person who comes to any conclusion under any circumstances, however justified. Well, as stated, the principle is absurd. We have to be able to come to conclusions. We can't keep, as that politician was accused of having, a wide open mind about literally anything. No. And that's the insidious nature of this package deal. If we don't, one, as she said in the beginning, take it straight, take it literal. What are the actual implications of this assertion as stated? I can never come to a conclusion? Take it straight. What does that imply? And then analyze, what are the fundamentals? What is that basically assuming in saying that? And our ability to break it down and get to the valid concept that Ayn Rand much better identifies here. The bad thing is a passive mind, not one that refuses to come that never comes to conclusions. The good thing is an active mind, but that active mind will come to conclusions, can achieve knowledge.
One point that I wanted to make is if you read this essay, you can fall too much into thinking that all catchphrases are bad. But I mean, Ayn Rand uses them all the time. Like, if you remember Introduction to Objectivism and Voice of Reason, she starts out with naming kind of metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics of objectivism, and then she goes, if you want it in simpler language, and I forget exactly what it is, but it's something like she uses Bacon's nature to be commanded has to be obeyed. Can't eat. Man is an end in himself, and give me liberty or give me death. Well, here's one interesting contemporary one. Why don't we analyze this catchphrase following Rand's method? It is what it is. We hear this all the time, right? And I think it's interesting in that one level, it's great. I mean, it's the best, catchphrase you could have because it's a statement of the law of identity. But one thing I've noticed, I'm curious what your impressions are here, is it can also be used in effect as the equivalent of you can't fight City Hall.
Right. There's nothing.
Right. So it will often blend the metaphysical and the man-made.
Right.
And
a beautiful package deal, actually, of mixing the metaphysical and the man-made, isn't it? Sometimes we can use it to make a good, correct statement. A is A. Existence exists. Okay, is that what you mean? It is what it is? Or do you mean there's nothing we can do about it? Which is sort of the implication, which requires passivity, and we just have to accept it, even if we don't like it, and it's man-made, which we don't have to do. It's an insidious package deal, isn't it? Has to be taken straight. I mean, in one sense, if you took it straight in one narrow context, and you were careful about your context, all I mean here is that the metaphysically given is the metaphysically given, and existence exists, and A is A. Okay, that would be the valid use. I'm not saying that humans don't have free will and can't make things better and can't change things for the better over here, because is what it is could imply that as well. And that very distinction is what a catchphrase like that screams out for. Some philosophical thinking. Well, do you mean this or do you mean this? Because it can imply both, in effect. And we can't let them get away with both while using that, because they get their foot in the door with the partial truth, and then they get us to accept a wider conclusion. Well, there's nothing we can do about anything. There is no man-made. There's nothing you can control about your life. What? That's not implied by existence exists or A is A. Which maybe it's you mean.
and I think the way to the part of what it illustrates is just that catchphrases aren't enough. They're helpful, the good ones, because they help you retain in kind of a common sense way and get a feel for a big idea, right? You can communicate it to people in a way where they can kind of get, okay, I know what you're talking about. But on the other hand, they're never enough, because even take something like, give me liberty or give me death. Well, what is liberty? Right. And is liberty something at odds with life? Or, man is an end in himself. Well, yeah, that Ayn Rand, that summarizes Ayn Rand's ethics. But Kant would say it summarizes it. Like, in fact, to go back to your point, James, his case against masturbation was you're not treating yourself as an end in yourself. You're treating yourself as an amusement park, as a means to an end. And so like that can't be right. So it's catchphrases are they're not maniacal, and they can often be good and indeed indispensable for holding an idea in kind of a crisp way that elicits kind of connotes a kind something. So it's not just like liberty is freedom from force. It's give me liberty or give me death. This is something valuable. This is something important. And notice it's I said, well, what is liberty? Well, it was said by a founding father of the United States, so it's capturing like
he had a good idea of what
a guy fighting for the American conception of liberty. Yeah. But that's part of the issue, is that we can't dispense with catchphrases, but they're not enough. We need philosophy. We don't all need to become philosophers, and indeed, we don't all need to study philosophy as much as the people who are listening to this video have. But we need to put in some time, because even a phrase is potentially powerful, a catchphrase is powerful and useful as it is what it is. It is. I was trying to do a play on words, but I can't come up with it off the cuff. It's imperfect, let's say.
Right. Another catchphrase, just a restatement of one of the catchphrases Ayn Rand uses here that we hear all the time in recent years, is his experience, his truth, his reality. That person, she should be able to explain her truth to the world, as if truth was an individual subjective matter, as if there was no truth available to everyone else. Now, again, there's a seductive part of it. It's true. Truth is only known in individual minds. We each have a unique context. We each have a unique perspective. That does not mean that there isn't a single reality out there and a truth we can all get at, which is another implication of the, it's her truth. It's her experience. It's her reality. We hear that all the time, and it's sort of seductive because there is something to it. Only individual minds know anything. Only individual contexts can come to know. Basically, though, what Don is saying is really true. A concept or a proposition can be true, but only in the wider context of its relationship to everything else we know and the facts of reality. All of knowledge is a process of integration. Philosophy is the master integrator, the widest integrator. So we can never rely on a single catchphrase, however useful it might be in a certain context. We have to understand its relationship to all of our other ideas and how it's grounded and reduced to reality, to straight observation.
Well, there's only one catchphrase we can use without any context, and that is, it's always in the last place you look. Because if you were still looking after you found it, you are making a big mistake under any conceivable context.
That's a good
one. I think my last question is, what is the power of Ms. Rand's ideas for the people who want to become a philosophical detective?
Well, Rand is doing philosophy. She's actually applying philosophy to the real world. She's actually trying to understand the relationship between human beings and the world, their consciousness and existence. It has direct practical importance in every field, every subject, our knowing, our doing. The power of Ayn Rand is that hasn't chucked in the idea that philosophy is some useless word game over here, this chess game that philosophers are somehow playing that has no real bearing on human life. And by the time of the 20th century, when linguistic analysts and, logical positivists and existentialists have sort of taken over the world, it becomes people, my dad, when I wanted to go study philosophy, scientific, good guy, really a good guy. Why are you studying that nonsense? And Ayn Rand kind of gets to that here. That's one of the worst mistakes you can make. No, yeah, philosophy has made some mistakes, but it's a vital subject. An overwhelmingly important, a life and death important subject. Our conclusions in politics and ethics and aesthetics will rely upon the work we do or don't do in philosophy. Philosophy today has abandoned that, chucked in all that. Ayn Rand, practically the only mind in the last 300 years to give that kind of consideration to the practical need of philosophy in human life. That's why it belongs in this book, Philosophy Who Needs It.
And I also think there's a really underserved kind of subject, which is, you could think of it as like epistemology for everyone. What are the practical tips that all of us need? And I mean, this essay is filled with things that are, usable and useful to everyone. Greg Salmieri did a couple talks where he was kind of giving practical everyday advice for how we can consult with experts, how we can be more objective in our thinking. And it's shocking to me how many people who they'll become with like, oh, I'm gonna like delve into the depths of how to have the best philosophic methodology, and I'm studying Francis Bacon and learning kind of the ins and outs of how induction works and so on, and all that's great. But are you even doing kind of the first pass advice Rand is giving you of like introspect, use your concepts with like total clarity where you can spot everything in reality? And it's like, until you're doing that stuff, you have no business worrying about the other stuff. I mean, it's fine if you want to do it, but I'm not criticizing people who are ambitious about issues in epistemology, but you'll often see this come up in other fields, right? Like, how many people are like, oh, I'm going to lose weight, and they're obsessive about the latest study on should I be taking this much protein in the morning, or should I wait until the evening meal, and what is this particular vegetable the one with the most nutrition? And it's, yeah, well, you're still eating a bag of Doritos every night. Like, no, start by not doing that.
Right.
And then we can worry about the details. And I think, like, start with the advice in this essay. Take it seriously. Make it, make it the kind of core of how you approach ideas in life. And then, you can definitely benefit from refining and deepening, your kind of methodological capabilities. But this is really the starting point. And in many ways, it's all you really need if you really carried it through in your life and your thinking.
Very well said.
Thank you. And people can also be philosophical detectives, even in regard to objectivism, right?
Right. Philosophy can be used by the layman. In fact, at some level, even the layman needs philosophy and needs to be somewhat thoughtful about philosophy. That's what makes it distinct and unique to any other subject. And that's what explains the power and persistence of religion. People need some kind of philosophical framework. And if philosophers aren't going to give us a rational one grounded in reality, people are stuck with the old philosophical systems of the past. So, yeah, philosophy is an essential for human life, and the ordinary person, to some extent, even the ordinary layman, needs to some extent to be a philosophical detective just to make sure their own thinking is straight.
And I mean, so yeah, definitely we need to be philosophical detectives with objectivism. But I mean, one of the things that is, so there's often these shortcuts to thinking that are kind of really good rules of thumb. Well, one of them is, if a person is telling you openly, these are my starting points, this is how it relates to everything that comes later, and I'm defining all my terms along the way, that's a good signal that, like, maybe they're at least worth listening to and entertaining. I mean, the amazing thing about objectivism, and this is precisely because it is a true philosophy, and so we're not trying to hide anything or get away with anything, is Rand is naming her starting point. She's saying, like, this is how I'm starting. This is what I'm taking for granted. This is how all the ideas relate all the way back to the axioms. And indeed, one of the great achievements of Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectives in the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, is to be extremely mindful of basically making explicit throughout the book how virtually every idea ties back to the foundational ideas. And so it's a lot easier. It's still hard, but it's a lot easier to be a philosophic detective when the philosophy is trying to make it easy for you, when it wants to be understood, when it wants you to grasp the tide of reality, when it's not trying to get away with anything. And when you contrast that with virtually any other philosopher, it's like night and day. And it's a general rule in life, and not just in philosophy, that when somebody's really trying to make it easy for you to understand what they're saying and why it's true, that's a good sign that you're dealing with somebody. And I mentioned Greg Salmieri's advice on how we can deal with experts. That's one of the things. If you have an expert who's trying to make it their advice and their conclusions clear to you, versus they're trying to just get you to take them on authority, or they're using a bunch of jargon that they won't bother to explain, you get the sense they're trying to intimidate you into taking them on faith. Well, run from that person like the plague. And I think objectivism is quite unique in the degree to which I think it strives to insist on these kinds of issues.
Note Rand's clarity, the lucidity, the acuity, the straightforwardness of her writing. Compare that to the writing of Hegel and Kant. Practically incomprehensible. Practically incomprehensible. And that's no accident. It's not as though their motive was getting at the truth and getting others to see the truth in a straightforward way. That's what Rand's mode was. She wants to be understood. She wants you to understand her premises, where she's coming from, how she grounds it in reality, the facts behind the meaning of her concepts, what I really mean here in concrete terms, which gives her writing such enormous clarity. Whereas someone like Hegel, you've got to, does he mean that? Does he mean that? And wait a minute, I can't hold on to this, because the whole sentence, is the page-long sentence. No, that tells you something right away about the honesty or dishonesty, the rationalization, the level of rationalization, or the level of honesty and sincerity in a thinker.
Thank you. With that being said, I thank you for this incredible conversation. I thank also the super chatters, Robert Naser, and who says ARC UK rocks. I agree with him. And also to Gail Parker. If you want to continue these conversations, if you enjoy them, you can join, become a member. Membership start with £10 a month, and you can be part of the Thursdays communication boot camps with Don Watkins. It's never too late to come to these ones. And also, if you want to continue with these interesting talks, in 30 minutes, Maria and Nicholas will be talking about Married to the Friend Zone in Flirting with Reason number 5. I think they will be talking about Friends, relationship between Monica and Chandler. So if you like Friends, tune in. If you don't like Friends, also tune in. Listen to them. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Another great discussion, guys.
Thanks, everyone.